Well done. 9.5. Tēnā koe te whare. Tēnā koutou te whānau o te whare paramata. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Members, when we broke for the dinner adjournment, we were debating the Taxation Residential Land Withholding Tax GST on online services and student loans bill. We're expecting our next speaker from New Zealand First.
Thank you very much. That's one way to phrase it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
You're seeking the call. I didn't.
I do. Please take the call.
Fletcher Tabuto.
Thank you, sir. It's my pleasure to stand up and take this call on the taxation bill. I just want to start off with the fact that New Zealand firms have been forced to play on an uneven playing field for the last few years. We've been talking about businesses who are having to operate in a tax environment that gives advantages to overseas firms instead of this government creating a level playing field. Actually, the reality is overseas firms, for whatever reason, whatever decision-making process goes on the other side of the house there, this government has taken years to come to this stage where they've had to acknowledge the fact that small to medium enterprise in New Zealand have been struggling with a very real issue around competing with overseas firms who haven't had to pay the GST on goods and services, Mr. Speaker. So what that has done is meant that our local firms, sir, are here in New Zealand complying with what is essentially an unfair law that has put them on the back foot. And the reality is, and we've seen it, New Zealand First has seen it firsthand, we've spoken to small business and we've heard from them, and they've told us that not only has it compromised profits, it's actually made it very hard to undertake a business in, say Rotorua, for example. A bookstore in Rotorua having to compete with an online bookstore where from the outset they have an overseas firm such as Amazon has a competitive advantage in terms of size, and then they get the 15% in terms of the GST on top of that. It's been unfair, and the government's only addressing it now. But what we're seeing is a kind of a half attempt, and it's even more frustrating because what we're seeing is, for example, you buy an e-book on Amazon, and after this legislation is passed, the Amazon will be required to take the GST and pay that. But you buy the same book in the hard copy version, and you don't. There's no GST on that. It just is completely illogical, makes no sense whatsoever, and is completely frustrating not only for New Zealand First, but for small to medium enterprise businesses in New Zealand who are having to cope with the realities of this government's apathy. It's just taking too long. They're not serious about a very real issue, and it is compromising New Zealand business, sir. So what we're saying is this tax component is an effort to level the playing field, but it doesn't go far enough, and this government needs to step up, and it needs to step up very fast, because as I pointed out, it's not just it's not just small businesses struggling to cope with, unfair tax. It's compromising not only profitability, but the livelihoods of men and women who are working hard in their small businesses. So that needs to be addressed. One of the other parts that has been raised earlier this evening was the actual revenue collected from the GST. It's not really that big a deal. You're talking about $40 million. I'm glad I'm entertaining Mr. Seymour. He seems to entertained by just about anything at the moment. But the reality is, if they'd actually implemented the tax for just not the tangible but the tangible goods, you would have been talking about some real revenue take. The reality is that's not the issue at the moment, the fact that we're only getting 40 million from the intangible GST tax take. The issue is the levelling of the playing field. The issue is that small to medium New Zealand businesses will then be able to compete on a reasonably level playing field with international competition. New Zealand First was glad to note the threshold for overseas companies in terms of registering for the GST, the $60,000 per year income. Although we noted that there was a $10,000 threshold proposed earlier in the piece, and we probably would have supported that level as well. I think one of the problems we'll find in this particular aspect is actually assessing and getting meaningful information from overseas businesses about what their incomes are and whether they meet the threshold or not. Speaking to the student loans part of the legislation, sir, you're talking about 110 New Zealanders living overseas with student loans, approximately $3.2 billion still being owed. And in this instance, New Zealand First says, well, good New Zealanders here in New Zealand are obliged to make their contribution. They're being held to account. And so actually it is fair and reasonable to expect those students overseas to do the same. It was pleasing to note the streamlining effect of the rules applying to Kiwis living overseas. For example, there was a fix-up of some of the exemptions around Kiwis living overseas who are working for charitable organisations, for example. Their exemption will continue, and they'll be able to do good work, as it were, without worrying about their student loan in the meantime. Mr Speaker, New Zealand First is concerned with the proposed changes in order to facilitate better and more comprehensive information sharing between New Zealand's Inland Revenue and the Australian Taxation Office. Fair's fair. If New Zealanders at home are paying, then those abroad should do the same. What we're concerned with, however, is this government has refused to put pressure on the Australian government around their treatment of New Zealanders in Australia and essentially making them second-class citizens. So the point is, if the rules were applied evenly and fairly, if we were treating New Zealanders in Australia who've been living there for 40 years, for example, the same as a Australian-born citizen, then you could say, well, let's get in there and apply this. Let's be vigorous about it, make sure that they're not escaping the net. The reality is, though, that New Zealanders are living there as second-class citizens, and so I challenge some of those backbenchers over there in the government party to actually go and have meaningful discussions first about how to treat New Zealanders fairly in Australia, and instead of prioritising the collection of student loan debt when there are so many bigger issues to be dealt with in the first place. Mr Speaker, New Zealand First opposed the Bright Line Bill because our own analysis, the analysis of Mr Seymour, the analysis of every single expert that submitted, not just one or two of them, but every single expert who submitted on the Bright Line test, told us and saw very quickly that this piece of legislation would achieve none of the stated objectives that it set out to achieve. In fact, it would add even greater levels of complexity to the situation. So I won't go into detail because I don't have the time, but Mr Seymour could do some reading perhaps this evening and get a little bit of the detail. But because the bell's already rung, sir, I better jump to my conclusion. And please, my audience, thank you. We actually can't support this bill. Our opposition to the theatrics and empty platitudes from this national government regarding the Bright Line legislation are just too strong. Voting for this supporting legislation would simply give tacit endorsement of that waste of time piece of empty puffery. And no, I'm not talking about Mr Seymour. Sir, the reality is There are three distinct parts in this legislation. I genuinely implore the Minister to break this legislation up. I ask him to present them as independent pieces of legislation so that New Zealand First could support the good stuff, the common sense pieces, the student loan and the taxation. But as for the rest of it, sir, we've got issues and therefore we can't support the bill as presented to the House this evening. Thank you.